Ayo, straight from his home in Baltimore, Maryland. It ain't quite live, but it's right on time. It's the Mr. Lewis Weekly Update with your host, Mr. Lewis.
Thanks, Jelani. That's right, folks. My good buddy Jelani Summersall is now the official announcer of the Mr. Lewis Weekly Update. Don't worry, he's getting paid with nothing but my love and devotion. Sadly, social distancing, I can't pay up just yet. But hopefully, this will all end at some point and I can give him all of his well-deserved payments. Before we jump into today's show, a couple announcements for my students. Don't forget, Tuesdays and Wednesdays are days for online classes. 30 minutes, it's real quick. Come by, see us. If you're not sure when it is, check your Schoology page for that class. Remember, Tuesdays are A-Day classes, Wednesdays are B-Day classes. But we're there. Come see us. Keep us company. We're on there for the full 30 minutes. Don't leave me like this. So with that being said, we're going to move right into today's show. We got a lot of fun stuff for you today. We got some special guests. We have some musical stuff. We got some stuff to make you feel happy in this terrible time. So, let's go to the big board.
You'll see everything. You'll see the big board.
That is precisely the idea, General.
This can be a really tough time for a lot of us. You know, we have to stay involved and aware of what's going on, both on the federal, state, and local level. Watching the news becomes part of our daily routine, if it wasn't already before. Hopefully, though, you are taking a break from watching some of that news, and you're watching some of the good news that is out there. The pandemic and the coverage of it sometimes makes you just want to scream. But don't worry, because there are a lot of people out there posting things to brighten your day and the days of others. John Krasinski from The Office has started his online show dedicated to just good news. Great name. It's called Some Good News. Hey, John, if you're watching, I'm not trying to rip you off. Ironically, though, I probably will rip you off a couple of times. But I just discovered some good news the other day. Thank you, my wife. So for our next segment, let's take a break from the sadness and get with the gladness. Jelani, what's our next segment called?
Bringing you some good news for a better mood. Here's a little bit of happiness.
As many of you know, I'm not on social media. You've probably tried looking me up, or not. Who really cares? But my lovely wife has done some great research to find a little bit of happiness for me to share with all of you, or, you know, some good news. Our first bit of good news comes from a post she saw on the Washington Post, something dedicated to those on the front line.
And one of the places hit the hardest in the United States is New York. And this is a great thing to see. People cheering and clapping on the healthcare workers who are truly the soldiers on the front line fighting this coronavirus, this COVID-19. So let's hear it for those cheering them on.
The next one's real quick. This fella's ready to fight COVID-19. That's what I call open carry. A little bit of happiness that happened to my wife and I was we ordered pizza the other week, and when it came, well, that's right, it came with free toilet paper. I mean, I don't know about you, but that's my biggest concern right now. Dominic's Pizza, if you're watching, thank you. You are my hero. This next little bit of happiness takes place here in Baltimore, Maryland, from Imagine Engineers. What they did is they lit up the city. And you can see this in other cities, but they lit up the city with lights. Once again, dedicated to those hard-working first responders on the front line. This next one has nothing to do with COVID-19, but I've watched it at least a dozen times, and it gets me laughing every single time. I mean, if this little boy doesn't get you laughing, I'm worried about you. Here we go.
Ready? Yeah. Clap, clap, clap your hands, clap your hands together. Clap, clap, clap your hands, clap your hands together. Everybody clap. Everybody clap. And now we're gonna go faster. Are you ready? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Everybody clap. Everybody clap.
I'd like to end today's segment of a little bit of happiness with a message from some friends of mine in New Orleans. New Orleans, as you know, has been hit very, very hard during this pandemic. Musicians have been hit really hard during the gig economy. If they don't play, they don't make money. A lot of people have gotten together to help, reconcile this issue. But a lot of musicians are scattered still throughout the United States and throughout the world who can't get back to their homes in New Orleans. So here's a message from a couple of New Orleans friends of mine. Jelani, go ahead and cue it up.
Now, a public service announcement from our friends in Bon Bon Vivant.
There are blues when you've been sequestered, and there are blues when you're feeling bored. Toilet paper ration, jam to daily fashion, Netflix and Facebook galore. There are blues that you get from 6 foot space, and you just need someone to hold. Whoa, this quarantine, it feels so mean. I know you miss your social scene, so sing those blues and stay your ass at home. Sing those blues and stay your ass at home.
Thank you, Ryan, Bobby Beige Brown, and Glory Casillo. I can't thank you guys enough. That was a great song. Stuff like that, songs, videos, anything you can do to just brighten someone's day is always fantastic. Jelani, I think it's time for another one of our new segments. What's this new segment you got for me?
To keep you abreast of what's relevant, let's get to poppin' fresh with professionals.
What I'm going to try to do every week is have a professional in some field come and talk to you. This week, it's a dear friend of mine, Dr. Daniel Ritchell. He is a British historian. He works as a professor at UMBC. Some of you might even get to take a class if you decide to go to that fantastic institution. So let's see if we can get Dr. Ritchell on the Google Meets real quick.
Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Ritchell. How you holding up with this quarantine and government shutdown, essentially?
I'm surviving quite well. As you probably know, most historians spend a lot of their time working on their own writing, and this just gives me more time to do that.
So last week I encouraged the students to keep some kind of journal, some kind of documentation, log, digital, written down, something along those lines, to document what it's like to be in Maryland, in Baltimore, in Dundalk during this pandemic. You had mentioned prior the mass observation in Britain during the 30s. Could you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, mass observation is one of these most interesting institutions to come out of the 1930s. It was founded by 3 men, an anthropologist, a documentary filmmaker, and a journalist. And their desire was to find out what ordinary people felt and thought. And they were convinced that newspapers took liberties in gauging how the public felt about important events of the day. They thought that most middle and upper class educated people had absolutely little understanding of how ordinary people in Britain felt about things. And they were reluctant to adopt the so-called scientific opinion polling strategies because they wanted to find out not just how people felt about important issues, about issues important to the educated classes, but about issues important to the people themselves. And so they invited they advertised in journals and in newspapers, usually by writing letters and asking the readers to come and join this new enterprise. And then they invited the participants that responded to write diaries, to do things like record their dreams, to answer questions based on specific directives and prompts that they would periodically send to them. And so they engaged several hundred people from across Britain, starting in 1937, in what really became this incredible experiment in recording ordinary people's opinions, ordinary people's lives, daily experiences of life in the coming war and then thereafter. Some of the material is being written still to this day. And the archive now has opened up, the last of the Mass Observation Archive has opened up material that was written in the 1980s.
Oh, wow. So the archive is available to the mass public, being that it's a mass observation?
It's available to the public. Much of it has been digitized.
Well, that's good. That tends to be a problem in our field. I know right now my research is on hold because
Right.
everything in New Orleans is not in the archives and not in museums, so it's creating a massive issue for myself, and I'm sure for the rest of y'all.
Right. A lot of it is digitized now. Unfortunately, a lot of it is behind a paywall. And so you get to see some material, but you don't get to see all of the material. But there's such a large treasure trove of material that it's really well worth just visiting the website, visiting to see what it is that the people wrote about, and then perhaps thinking about what we could do about that today.
Um, I read an article with Dr. Freud. I believe I'm saying her name right. I've actually never met her, and that she did with the retriever, and she had this quote: "The more mundane, the better." Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, mundane. You see, they're not interested in sort of the kind of things that newspapers are interested in. They weren't interested in sort of sophisticated cultural issues or political issues. They were interested in daily life. And so some of the things that they asked people to write about was they asked people to write about pets. They asked people to write about bathroom behavior. They asked people to write about the various shouts and gestures that car drivers made while sitting in their cars and driving. They asked about dirty jokes.
Nice.
Um, they asked about beards and eyebrows and armpit hair. Uh, they asked about pubs. They asked about what the English call sweet shops, candy stores. They asked about smoking habits. But they also asked, eventually, it turned out that, of course, ordinary people in ordinary lives are not all that different. And so they ended up gauging their experiences in some of the more momentous events of the war, the Blitz, the blackout, wartime rationing. The participants wrote about everything and anything imaginable.
So, how could we relate what we're going through right now with this current pandemic? Um, how can we relate this? Like, how how can my kids simple maybe tweet or TikTok video, or even just their diary they keep at home, talking about how bored they are, and my crazy teacher, Mr. Lewis, just keeps giving me work to do. How could this be helpful to historians 5 years down the road, 50, 100 years, long after our time?
Well, we're all sitting at home. We're all experiencing this crisis in the privacy of our own homes, privacy of our own rooms. And what historians will want to know 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line is what did we do? How did we feel? How did we experience all of this? And the only way we can learn about that is if people who go through these experiences today tell us about it. And the best time to tell us about it is not 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. That's interesting as well, but memories change. The time to tell us about it is now. And so if we all keep a record, journal, diary, entries in TikTok, keep keep our messages to our friends, all of those things will give us a sense of what life was like during the coronavirus epidemic, and how people survived, and the kind of devices people came up with to make that survival entertaining, but perhaps also the boredom. Boredom is an important aspect of daily life, and we should perhaps not celebrate it, but maybe we should certainly record it for posterity.
Is there anything in particular you're doing to beat the boredom?
uh, I'm grading papers.
I'm right there with you. I'm right there.
I'm reading
Little
thesis
Beatles album.
manuscripts. Yes.
Oh, fun. Put on a little Beatles album or something while you
Yeah,
do.
but mostly, to sort of entertain myself, I've been gardening,
Yeah.
and gardening is one of these wonderful experiences. Now the spring is here. You can watch plants and flowers grow, and they're your own creation because you started them from seed. I'm looking forward to that, and I'm really engaged busily in that whenever I'm not grading or reading thesis manuscripts. I'm also holding meetings, and we all of us are having meetings online. and like you and I, we tend to communicate now over the internet. If this had happened, one of the things that your students may be interested in considering is if this had happened 15, 20 years ago, then we would have been completely isolated.
Oh yeah, I remember being in high school. It was crazy to use computers. They would hand us a laptop maybe once or twice a year, and that was to type your capstone paper or some big project. And I remember, and I went to college in the early aughts. When Blackboard first came out, we were all like, "This is amazing!" And now my kids use something called Schoology, which is essentially Blackboard and Facebook mashed together. And it's
Right.
but there's still a lot of schools out there. My wife's county doesn't have that, and the kids don't have computers. So my kids are lucky that they have a device and a system that they can do that. But yeah, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it would have been a completely different story for sure.
We could all be alone and yet be alone together.
Yes.
We can communicate with one another, and I've spent more time talking to relatives and friends and students than I have at any time in the past when I would have waited to do it face to face.
So it's almost like the social distancing is almost bringing us together in other ways we normally put off and not think about.
I think so. I think so. And now we're given more time to experience these things, and it's fun. I mean, I'm not wasting my time driving to work and driving back from work. I'm not wasting my time in endless meetings. Now I get to appreciate life and to meet my friends online. And in some ways, but as I said, I'm an academic, and academics tend to lead solitary lives. So this just gives me more of the kind of stuff I like.
Okay. Well, Dr. Thank you so much for meeting with us today. It was super helpful, and I know the kids will enjoy it as well.
Darn. I'm out of coffee again.
Nothing like a look back at what used to be, so here's a flashback to this day in history.
This day in history, April 13th, 1861. Union forces surrender at Fort Sumter. The American Civil War has begun. After a 33-hour bombardment by Confederate cannons, Union forces surrendered Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. After nearly 4,000 rounds were hurled towards the black silhouette of Fort Sumter, the first engagement of the war ends with a rebel victory.
So let's check out this week's open letter.
First, let's see what's in the box.
What's in the box?
Really? This is get. Britt, did you put this in the box? It was probably put in here as a joke, but let's go with it. Today in the box we have a safety razor. We also have a shaving cream brush. Most of you guys out there probably don't use this, but it helps put on the shaving cream. But, dear Safety Razor, not only did you help our soldiers in World War I not transmit and spread lice and diseases, but you also keep guys like myself today looking good, silky smooth. I'm not cutting this off. I don't care what they tell you. But, dear Safety Razor, thank you for all that you've done in the past. Well, everybody, thanks for coming out to the second episode of the Mr. Lewis Weekly Update. Thanks to all my special guests, Dr. Richel, Jelani for now being our announcer, Bomb, Vivant, and all the great people posting good news on the internet. Make sure that you're still practicing social distancing. Make sure that you are still washing those hands and being like Miss McDermott. But also, remember, do your work, come to class, stay safe, stay smart, stay stellar. I'll see you next week.
Plenty money, 1922. You let all the women make a fool of you. Why don't you do right
No, we're good. We don't need any more. We're good.
That's all, kid.